Thank you for joining today's event. We will begin shortly. Please enjoy today's event.
Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Gleed, Dean of NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Welcome to the latest collaboration between NYU Wagner and the Century Foundation. Welcome to our esteemed speakers and to our guests. The Supreme Court's ruling ending race-conscious admissions programs has left colleges and universities scrambling for other methods to achieve racial diversity on campus. We face a real likelihood of reduced enrollment of students of color at some of the nation's selective institutions that will narrow those students' higher education options and the nature of the communities in those universities. Today, you'll hear a conversation focused on the ramifications of the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision and about how policymakers and colleges can improve equitable access to higher education. We understand that we may have some individuals with low vision joining us today. So to help set the stage for them, I'm going to ask all of our participants to please describe yourselves and your settings before you speak. I am at NYU Wagner. I'm sitting in front of a window. So there's a window screen behind me. I'm wearing a navy blazer and a black sweater, and I have salt and pepper short hair, and I have a goldish colored set of beads on. And you can see people walking behind the screen behind me. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. If you would like to submit a question for our panelists, please do that using the chat feature. And now please welcome Mark Zuckerman, President of the Century Foundation.
Thanks so much, Sherry. And it's great to do another event with NYU. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Zuckerman, President of the Century Foundation. I am in my DC office, and I'm wearing a blazer and a blue shirt and glasses. And again, it's great to have you join us. For those not familiar with Century, we're a progressive think tank, and we work on economic, racial, gender, and disability equity in healthcare, the economy, and education. Today, we're discussing the ramifications of the Supreme Court's decision on race-based affirmative action from this past summer and exploring both how policymakers and colleges can ensure racial diversity on campuses in light of this decision. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Denise Smith, our moderator for today, who is the Deputy Director of Higher Education Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation. Denise's work at TCF focuses on promoting diversity in post-affirmative action world, the financing of historically Black colleges and universities, and the role of government funding in empowering these institutions. Prior to joining TCF, she was a director of student engagement and college activism at Truth Initiative. Through her research, Denise has shown a light on the vast funding disparities facing historically Black colleges, work that many in Congress have taken note of and are taking steps to address. I can't think of anyone better to moderate today's conversation with such esteemed panelists. Over to you, Denise, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate that. Again, I'm Denise Smith, the Deputy Director of Higher Education Policy at the Century Foundation. I am wearing a gray blazer, and I'm sitting in front of a bookcase, and I'm also wearing green glasses. I'm very, very excited about this panel today, and I'm excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, Tressie McMillan Cottom. She's a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. She's also a columnist for New York Times, as well as the 2020 MacArthur Fellow. Thanks, Tressie. We next have Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Thanks for joining us, Damon. And finally, we have John B. King Jr., Chancellor of the State of University of New York System, as well as a former Secretary of Education during the Obama administration and TCF board member. Thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited to have this conversation. So to really kick us off today, I think it would be great for us to share with the audience who are made up of college students, Hill staffers, community members, just to give them a little bit of insight into how we got here to this decision. And Damon, I think you might be the best person to provide us with that context.
Sure. Damon Hewitt, just by way of introduction, I am sitting at my home, but what you see behind me, what is behind me rather, is a virtual background emblazoned with the logo of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Law, the organization that I'm proud to lead. Our mission is to ensure that Black people and other people of color have the voice, the opportunity, and the power to make the promises of our democracy real. Such a pleasure to join you today. Just in terms of how we got here, it has been in some ways a long and winding road. In some ways, it's been a rather direct route. Direct in the sense that as long as there have been affirmative action programs in this country, they have been under attack from day one, sometimes legal, sometimes political attack. So that's been a constant. A winding road in the sense that every time affirmative action went up to the US Supreme Court over at least the last 20 years since the Michigan cases, since Grutter, and also the Fisher case, the UT Austin cases, multiple of them, every time in those last 20 years, and if you go back even further, almost 50 years to Regents of California versus Bakke, back in 1978, every time justice prevailed, in my view. Every time we were told that we'd lose outright, that there was no hope for what we call affirmative action or race-conscious admissions, and every time up until recently, they were wrong. But what we saw over that time were saves in the courts, but unfortunately sometimes sabotage on campus, where there was this sense of inevitability that, well, these programs will fall. I think it's important to set that context. Now, for these particular cases, I would say we got to this particular result because of the concerted effort by anti-diversity, anti-civil rights groups like Students for Fair Admissions, the organization that Ed Blum created after his failed attempt to overturn race-conscious admissions at UT Austin. He spent years trying to scrub race out of all of our key democratic institutions. So not only did he create Students for Fair Admissions, but he also orchestrated the attack on the pre-clearance provision, Section 5, the heart of the Voting Rights Act. He is the force, the financial and other force behind the Supreme Court's decision gutting the heart of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, a little over a decade ago. What's particularly concerning in this most recent case at UNC and Harvard is that Blum also used, frankly, Asian American students as pawns to create a wedge issue and hide what he was really trying to do, which is, again, eradicate not racism, but eradicate race, which is, frankly, a fool's errand to the extent that race is a social construct, but also a damaging mission to the extent that race is part of not just a social construct, but how we all identify as people in terms of self-determination, not just the labels that other people put on us. At the Lawyers Committee, we've been at the forefront of the legal and other fights, legal and policy fights in both of those cases. We represent a group of multiracial students, or multiracial group of students rather, at both UNC and Harvard, and we were the only civil rights organization to argue the case in front of the Supreme Court because we had a status on behalf of our clients at UNC that allowed them to help develop the record at trial and go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, I think it's important to note, and I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, that what the Supreme Court did and did not do in this decision. I think it's important so that you can have this understanding for yourselves and use it as part of your own advocacy in policy. First, the Supreme Court did not explicitly overrule prior precedent in all those cases that I mentioned. The court did what we call underruled the precedent. It essentially didn't say that Bakke and Grutter are bad law. It essentially created, emphasized certain parts of those decisions and created, I guess, new hoops, frankly, to jump through, or emphasize hoops that were already there but had not been previously emphasized as strongly. It essentially has put the jurisprudence, the law, in a bit of a knot and has put higher ed leaders in a bit of a pickle. The court did not hold that race can never be considered a factor in admissions, but the court told us things like race can be a negative factor, even though we said it was a plus factor. The court held that you have to have clear articulable goals, but also that the plan has to be flexible, not inflexible, things that feel like they're a little bit in tension with each other. The decision does not affect the ability of schools to pursue diversity as part of their mission overall. In fact, there was a part of the decision where the majority wrote that nothing in this opinion prevents schools from asking students about their experiences with race in terms of discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. That has given rise to a re-emphasis on thoughtfully presented and hopefully thoughtfully responded to essay questions when it comes to student admissions processes. The decision does not automatically have reach to targeted recruiting or student affinity groups on campus and the like, although the decision clearly is paring back some of the circumstances in which race can be used. So after a decades-long mission, we're left in this bit of a pickle in a legal knot that higher ed leaders are left to try to disentangle, and we're here to help.
Thank you so much, Damon, for providing that context. And I think it kind of helps address a question I was thinking about. Next was really thinking about the impacts, right? Like I think a lot of people are thinking about this is going to affect elite institutions differently than public institutions. Some are concerned about whether or not this could potentially impact scholarship programs that are typically based on race, and could that be deemed illegal? I don't know if you have any thoughts on what this could potentially impact further.
Well, look, I predict attacks on all of the programs that I mentioned that are not automatically and immediately addressed. Those attacks will come. What we've been saying to our friends in higher ed is the same that we say to our friends in the corporate world, because we see, inspired by this Supreme Court decision, lots of attacks on what we call DEI in terms of the law of non-discrimination in contracts, government or private, the law of non-discrimination in the workplace, Title VII, equal employment opportunity. The Supreme Court decision has nothing to do with those contexts, but it's inspired lots of attacks. So what we're saying to higher ed and business leaders alike is that our risk calculus has to adjust for the times. The politics are on steroids right now. That means, and there's a very litigious atmosphere. There's lawsuits everywhere. Even, West Point and Naval Academy are being sued by these folks. Just because you're being sued doesn't mean you've done something wrong. And just because you're not being sued doesn't mean you're actually advancing the part of your mission that has to do with racial equity and diversity. And so we understand this. It feels like an impossible needle to thread, but the point is that there will be likely more lawsuits. What we want to avoid is, like I said earlier, the sabotage on campus. You want to comply with the decision, but it doesn't mean you have to neuter all race-conscious methods. Just in terms of impacts, though, the fact is, as you heard in the opening, the number of students of color from backgrounds and communities that are not well represented on elite college campuses is likely to fall if we let it. The day the Supreme Court decision was handed down, I said in our press conference that if they're going to try to remake the law, we may have to remake higher education. And so when we think about all of the barriers to access, those barriers are not new. Race-conscious admissions was an ameliorative, a corrective, but it wasn't a cure, so to speak, in terms of all the problems of access. We have to look at a lot of these policies. Many universities are, whether it be legacy admissions, which doesn't do all of the work here, but it could be part of their calculus. Whether it be preferences for children of donors or people affiliated with donors. People have a stereotype about athletes, and they think that Black and brown people are more likely to be athletes, but most NCAA athletes are actually white. And so I'm not saying that in of itself is a problem, but we have to get past these stereotypes. When you look at who has the scholarships on campus, it's not as if it's only Black and brown students. So what are the pathways to entry? And especially for institutions that consider themselves mission driven, as I think most do, especially our state institutions, and I think elite institutions that are private as well. We got to figure out, how do you really advance that mission? Can you advance the mission if you wind up like California, where we saw a 40% decrease in Black and Latino student admissions after Prop 209? There certainly has been progress there, but it took about a quarter century and about $500 million at least in intervention programs to try to make up that difference. That is not something that every institution is going to be able to do or every university system will do. Finally, I'll just say, in terms of impacts, there's a psychological toll. I think I really appreciated the messages from higher ed leaders who said immediately, not just we disagree with the Supreme Court decision, but that all of our students and our campus and alumni community are welcome. I think part of the psychological toll is that the message is sent that you don't belong, that higher ed isn't for everyone. There's some research, as I close this part, from Anthony Carnaval at Georgetown, who a decade or so ago wrote about how there are more Black and Latino students in higher ed than ever before, but there's an increasing stratification between selective and non-selective institutions. Now, that's an unfair label, some say, non-selective institutions. I think those are some of our most important institutions because they're mission-driven. For some, that may even include some of our HBCUs as well. But the point is that we shouldn't have a stratification as a naturally occurring phenomenon. In fact, I think it is not naturally occurring. It is our own policies and practices that put us there. So as far as the impact of the decision, it's going to be pretty bad if we let it. The question is, what political will and gumption do we have to readjust how we're admitting students, how we're caring for students, in order to make sure that all have access and success on campus?
Well said. And thank you so much for providing that additional context and giving us something to think about how we move forward. I do want to move us to getting a more on the ground approach. Chancellor King, I would love to just pivot to you to just see what's actually happening on the ground. And can you talk a little bit about how the SUNY schools are reacting to the decision and what you're seeing in your own admissions offices?
Sure. First, Denise, it's an honor to be a part of this conversation with you and with Tressie and Damon. I'm sitting in front of a State University of New York logo screen behind me in a gray pinstripe suit with a red tie, glasses, and a beard that is more gray than I like to admit. So, I think Damon did a really powerful job of describing the case and the danger that our Black, Latino, and Indigenous young people may come away from this Supreme Court decision hearing a message that they are not welcome. And our commitment at the State University of New York is to send the opposite message. In fact, the message we try to send in everywhere we go in the state is there's a place for every New Yorker at SUNY. We've got 64 campuses across the state, 30 community colleges, and then our four-year institutions and our graduate institutions. The decision is most relevant really to our research universities and some of our graduate programs, our medical schools, our law school, because on the whole, the vast majority of our institutions are accepting the majority of students. And that's the reality of American higher education. We spend a lot of time talking about a very small number of highly selective institutions, but the real work of higher education, the large numbers of students are coming through our public higher ed institutions that are doing the important work of preparing the workforce and citizens of the future. That said, we see this as a moment to double down on diversity, equity, and inclusion as core to who we are at SUNY. So we've been doing training for our admissions folks around the point that Damon made, that the decision allows campuses to consider students' description of the impact of race in their own lives. It's important that folks understand that, and we've done training to help them understand that. We also, in our Board of Trustees, committed to all of our institutions maximizing the use of race-neutral criteria that advance our diversity, equity, inclusion goals. So things like low-income status, first-gen status, students who are veterans, who are more diverse than the general population, AmeriCorps alumni. We partnered with the College Board to use their landscape tool to look at adversity that students may have overcome in their high school or in their community. So we are trying to make sure that we're using every tool available to have as diverse a class as possible. We also are taking a look at pipeline programs where we can expand those to increase the number of students of color on our campuses. So thinking about how we make it easier for students to transfer from community college to our four-year institutions. You know, nationally, 80% of the students who start community college say their goal is a bachelor's degree, but less than 20% earn that bachelor's degree. We need to work on that at SUNY and across the country. So we're trying to strengthen those pipelines. We have some of our four-year institutions that are predominantly diverse institutions, like SUNY Old Westbury, where I was yesterday. We want those institutions to be a pipeline to our medical schools and our law school and our other graduate programs. You know, we're targeting in our recruitment communities that have historically been underserved. One of our recent initiatives that we launched is we're sending a letter home to every high school senior in New York City, telling them there's a place for them at SUNY and walking through some of their options at SUNY. Last year, we sent a letter home to every high school senior outside of New York City, telling them that they're automatically admitted to their local community college and giving them the chance just to scan on the QR code to pick the program they want to pursue. So we're going to continue to do that work to make sure that students feel welcomed at our institutions.
Thank you so much for providing that. And I think it helps people to understand kind of what is happening at colleges and universities all across the country and how you all are thinking about it. And I think it brings a lot of people comfort to know that there are leaders like yourself that are actually being intentional about how folks are considering shifting the how we look at the admissions process. I do also want to pivot really quickly. You know, personally, I do a lot of work on HBCUs, and I've had conversations with folks about the role that this decision could potentially play with those institutions. So I do want to kind of bring them into the forefront because of the fact that there are so many challenges in higher education today. The institutions, specifically HBCUs, have been disinvested in or divested from over centuries, and they've been chronically underfunded. And I'm just curious, because of the recent influx in applications that a number of the institutions have received over the last year, just because of the decision, I'm curious about how you all, and Tressie, I think I would love to hear from you on this, about how the role that HBCUs play in this moment based on the decision.
Thank you. I'm Tressie. I am an African-American woman, short hair, black and white blouse, sitting in an office in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, green background and gold bookshelves behind me. Historically, Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, more broadly, as you well know, Denise, disproportionately serve students who are disproportionately selectively stratified out of the rest of higher education. And that's been the role of these institutions since their founding. And while the composition of the institutional field of higher education, who goes to college where, has changed, certainly as higher education expanded in the mid-20th century, the central role, especially of historically Black colleges, to the production of the Black middle class and the Black professional class, some of those students that John was talking about that will be disproportionately impacted by this decision. Students who intend to go to professional programs, law school, medical school, dentistry, et cetera. Those that intend to go on to graduate school, which in this economy are the majority of African-American students, have high educational aspirations, not just because we are inclined to pursue higher education, but we are deeply aware of the fact that we will face labor market discrimination, and to try to protect against that, we tend to pursue higher levels of education. So where this decision it's disproportionately impacts graduate schools, selective institutions that better prepare students for graduate study, professional programs. Those are exactly the types of programs and career paths that Black students, in particular minority students overall, tend to pursue when the ceiling, when there's no ceiling on their educational aspirations, right? And minority serving institutions and historically Black colleges over prepare students for those career aspirations, particularly relative to the amount of funding that they have. And as your work has shown, and as the work of many others has shown, these institutions are not just underfunded presently, they are chronically, historically underfunded. And then that the contemporary underfunding is then just another layer of sort of sediment on top of the inherited effect of the underfunding of these institutions. So then we have a problem, right? We have institutions that know how to do this job. They know how to serve this population that will be disproportionately impacted, and they know how to do it in a culturally responsive way at a time when higher education is feeling more hostile to those students. They are, however, constrained by the lack of resources, the lack of infrastructure that the inheritance of chronic underfunding has made more likely at these institutions. And then all of this is happening in a political climate that frankly made the Supreme Court decision possible. I point out Damon's point that this is a legal decision facilitated by a political climate, right? And this is a political climate that still exists, one that is more than happy to continue to weaponize these sort of differences and debates to the detriment of students. And so all of this is a perfect storm for higher education, for minority serving institutions and historically Black colleges to have high demand and to not have the resources to meet that demand without compromising their educational quality, the very thing on which they tend to be overjudged and under-resourced to provide as it is. So I think, you speak to higher education leaders across that sector and they say, we know how to do this, right? We are prepared to do this in theory and historically and culturally. But we would need, for example, in the state of North Carolina, the Department of Education, Secretary of the Department of Education has sent out letters to states across the country just this week. The states where there is a demonstrated pattern of chronic underfunding of historically Black colleges across this country. One of them went out to the state of North Carolina. And I think the statistic, they show that the historically Black colleges in this state are underfunded to a tune of $2 billion compared to the other land grant institutions in the state. And that's roughly comparable to the other states that were mentioned. Florida, for example, Mississippi, other states that received that letter this week. So that means that we're presented with a problem that could be an opportunity if we have the political will, and that is to address both the historical cumulative effects of underfunding in a politically charged climate where any investment in historically Black colleges and universities is going to look like a political statement. And so it is an economic and an educational and policy problem with a political problem overlaid on top of it. But historically Black colleges know how to do this work. The problem has always been one of whether or not we will invest in them to do that work.
Very valid points. And it sounds like you also have policy recommendations for some people that are on the call as well. I know are taking notes. I guess I'm also just curious about, there's a lot of parents and families on the call, students are on the call, just curious about, what should they be doing, thinking about when it comes to navigating this application process and where they decide to go. I think you all brought up about how some institutions are taking different steps to address how they're doing this in admissions offices, but also HBCUs are taking these students. So I guess there's a lot of young people out there just trying to figure out how to navigate this process. Any feedback or thoughts for them?
Well, listen, this is Tressie, and I'll just say quickly, I suspect certainly my colleagues here have their own advice. First of all, I'd like to offer my sympathies. This is a complicated time to be making what is already a very emotionally fraught decision. Sometimes those of us in this world can forget how emotionally fraught it is because we succeeded at doing it. And, I think the memory of doing it fades pretty quickly in light of that eventual success. But this is an emotionally fraught time for families. And I hear from them. I know that anybody who has especially extended family, those of us, and we work in this sector, and they're reaching out to people wanting to know what is the secret sort of, what are the secret code words to unlock what they hope will be the sort of parallel path that will increase their odds of being not just seen, but valued by higher education institutions. So the calculus that we have invested a lot in training people on how to get into college, we need to speak about that more starkly. I think the reality is that depending on where you are attending, this will impact your decisions. It could impact your college climate. It can impact how effective the admissions offices are presently set up to read and evaluate your applications. Some institutions, by virtue of, we just came out of, several years of COVID and institutional changes, and we've got a lot happening here, especially on the admissions staffing side, that will make it difficult for institutions to wholesale rearrange their admissions process overnight. We're still in that sticky middle part, as John pointed out, where people are figuring it out. The admissions processes are not yet in place. I think the best thing that families can do is to look for institutions that have at least made the vocal commitment to figuring it out. And that is not every institution. So that is not something that goes without saying. There are institutions that have invested more in saying, we do not know how to do this well yet in a way that complies with the letter of the law without over interpreting that law to make the climate more hostile to these students, but we are committed to figuring it out. I have found that those institutions that are willing to be vocal about that are not hiding that fact. They are saying it in their admissions materials. They are saying that this is an excellent time for those who have the resources, and that's a really complicated thing to say. But if you have the resources to do it, campus visits, talking with people one-on-one is probably never been more important, I think, to the admissions decision than it is right now, when institutions have a chance to make a change, and not all of them will make positive changes in a way that align with your values, and it isn't all yet written out in the official documentation. You got to meet people and speak with them.
Yeah, the thing I'd add to Tressy's very good points. One is, and this relates to a point Damon made, there's something deeply problematic about saying, the Supreme Court saying, we're going to remove the responsibility of institutions to deal with the legacy of institutional racism, and we're going to put it on a 17-year-old. And as the father of a 17-year-old, I'm particularly conscious of how unfair that is to say, well, we're not going to deal with institutional racism. You tell us about the impact it had in your life at 17. That said, if I were advising parents as they navigate this process, particularly applying to highly selective institutions, students need to tell their full story, and they need to write like they expect it to go, and they want to be fully seen. And so share who they are, how different factors have shaped them. It's going to be important to do that in the application process. Second point I'd make is resource constraints are a huge challenge, particularly for students of color who are disproportionately low income, right, because of institutional racism. And we've got to make sure that every family does the free application for federal student aid. We could have a separate conversation about how we fund higher education in the United States and whether there are better ways to do it, which I think there are. But today, you need to fill out the FAFSA. There'll be a new FAFSA coming in December. In New York, last year, students left $200 million on the table in federal financial aid that they could have used to go to college because of not completing the FAFSA. So that's essential. And if you've done the FAFSA, a service you could do is find somebody else who needs to do it and help guide them through the process. The third point I'd make is really to double down on Tressy's point about campus climate. You know, it's easy to have a Black student or a Latino student on the cover of the brochure smiling. The real question is, how much are they smiling when they're not with the photographer, right? And so really getting to know the campus, talking potentially to students of color who attend to try to understand their experience, looking at the faculty. Is the faculty diverse? Is the staff diverse? Will students have an opportunity to see people who look like themselves in there and amongst the community of people responsible for their education? It's really important to ask those questions because institutions have an incentive to bring students to campus. That's not the same as the incentive to support them, have them have a healthy, positive learning experience and graduate. And folks really have to investigate that about the institutions they're looking at. And of course, go to SUNY.edu and think about coming to SUNY.
Good luck. This is Damon. I will just add first, I think Tracy and John made such compelling and smart points. The only thing I would add is two quick things. One, the Supreme Court did not censor students. So I think it would be a First Amendment problem if they did, in terms of talking about your identity and who you are, regardless of what the application process looks like. Find ways to talk about not just who you are. We don't mean, say, write an essay and say, as a Black young woman, I think this. That's very classic and rote. We want, I say we as if I'm not in higher ed, but we, meaning in the advocacy community, and I'm sure higher ed professionals, want to see how you think, how you process and analyze ideas. This is a very tortured and painful decade that our young people have experienced. I mean, from childhood to now young adulthood. When you think about, from Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Breonna Taylor to what's happening overseas right now, it can be traumatizing. But those young people who can talk about race, identity, not just their own, but how they process things in ways that are thoughtful, those are the leaders we need now, and certainly the leaders of the future. The last thing I would say is I think Tracy hit the nail on the head. I have deep empathy. This is a tough time for applicants, parents, and higher ed leaders alike. Think about the timing of the Supreme Court decision. Literally, as admission cycles were just about to begin, we pushed out our own point-by-point rebuttal to Ed Blum, who sent a letter to many higher ed leaders saying what you can do. We give a point-by-point rebuttal to that, saying he's wrong, here's what you can do. And I'm glad to see that the Departments of Justice and Education at the federal level, Chancellor King's erstwhile colleagues, they came forth with their own guidance. But it's so much to digest so soon. I think I want to see the numbers. I want to understand the processes, and I want to understand the perspectives from this admission cycle, and that's going to make us all stronger for the next cycle.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that it's a great segue into my next question about, I think a lot of the conversations that I've been hearing over the last few months about the affirmative action decision have really been deficit based, right? And I'm just curious, I'm an optimist. So what are the solutions? What are the opportunities that we see when it comes to being able to actually consider race or promote diversity in college admissions?
This is Damon. I'll start. I mean, I think it's some of us said already. I think the fact that the court has not foreclosed all consideration of race, it's difficult to conceive how race explicit, conversations can happen in a way that this court would uphold. But it's not a fait accompli as yet. What I would say more tangibly, and what we could access more, is these narratives that talk about one's experience with race, and I would say, and racism, right? Because race isn't the problem, although it's a social construct. I believe it is racism itself, and not just navigating across difference as if it's a struggle, but thriving in what is an emerging multiracial democracy. I think that being conversant and being able to talk about that and demonstrate that is a very clear avenue. As much as I'm concerned about so-called race-blind admissions processes, which I think are problematic in the sense that we can pretend that we don't see race, but our advice is essentially the opposite. I'm not sure what race-blind means when your essay is saying exactly who you are. I don't see what race-blind means in those kinds of contexts. I also think that, as I said earlier, I don't believe that changing or eliminating legacy admissions does all of the work, but I think we have to take a really hard look at the normative criteria that are used to either offer preference or on which we over-rely. In our merits brief in the Supreme Court case, we argued and cited evidence demonstrating that standardized test scores underpredict talent among Black, Latinx students in particular, underpredict talent. So if we're over-relying on standardized test scores, maybe that is part of our access problem. And so I think we need a fundamental reconsideration of what the process looks like. I have deep empathy about how hard it is for higher ed admissions professionals. There's a reason I always rationalize in my own mind as to why the Reuter case, which was the law school case at Michigan, was a success, but the Gratz case, the undergrad case, was not. There are many legal and factual reasons, but if you think about the difference in volume of applications one receives for a law school versus an undergraduate institution, especially a state flagship, you're talking about orders of magnitude. So the volume and having, as I think John said earlier, the resources, or maybe Tracy said it, the resources to be able to have a thoughtful admissions process is challenging, but I think that's what's going to be needed.
Two observations I make. One is, this is a moment I think that should call the country to ask whether we've had the right way of thinking about the higher education sector generally. You look at the endowment size of the most selective institutions. These are institutions that operate to exclude. They have huge assets and resources. And yet you look at the institutions whose mission is about access and opportunity, the engines of social mobility, they often have small, if any, endowment dollars. As Tracy described for HBCUs, these institutions are often underinvested in by the state. When you think about HSIs, you think about predominantly diverse public institutions throughout the country, think about our community colleges, underinvested in, even though these are the institutions that are doing the work of ensuring the health of our economy and our democracy. So this is a moment where I think we have to think bigger even than just the admissions process to say, should we reorient our investment towards the institutions that fulfill the promise of equality of opportunity? The second observation I make is, at least how we're thinking about it at SUNY, is we've got to do everything we can to create access and to lower barriers. So some examples. More opportunities to admit students simultaneously to a community college and a four-year institution, so they know they can automatically go on to that four-year institution. We're doing something called cascading admissions, where if you apply to one of our more selective institutions and you don't get in, we move your application immediately to our other institutions, and they reach out to you and say, we know you applied here and didn't get in, but we've got a seat for you at our institution, and let us tell you about the programs that we're offering. We have something we're doing called Transfer Match, where we are reaching out to students in our community colleges who've done well and saying, hey, there's a seat for you at this four-year institution if you want to transfer. Rather than waiting for them to apply, we're reaching out affirmatively to them. We've also got initiatives where students are jointly admitted to undergrad and to graduate school, which then takes out of their higher ed experience the stressful application process to medical school at the end of college, because they already know that's where they're going to go. And those kinds of access initiatives disproportionately benefit low-income students and students of color. And they're also the right thing if the goal is to be an engine of opportunity for the state and the country.
Yeah, I could not have said that better, John. I think this is a moment to not just to reimagine what higher education is, because we have imagined it differently. I always like to point out to people our current reality is actually quite new. The bigger story of higher education is one that expands opportunities to the middle class. It's a far longer history than the history we have in this present moment. But this is a question about not just what are we going to do with the students that are disproportionately negatively impacted by this affirmative action decision, by which we mean Black and minority students. This is a moment for everyone to ask, if this matters to me, what am I going to do about it? Meaning, am I going to consider this part of my criteria for what I consider a legitimate institution, whether I am Black or not, whether my student is minority or not? This gets to John's point about the we in that time to reconsider, we need to reconsider what higher education means to us. It's not just a conversation that needs to be had among the students that are carrying the burden, frankly, of trying to live with this new affirmative action reality. This is a decision for everyone to decide, do I invest my money? Do I invest my faith? Do I invest my energies in institutions that do not live up to the spirit of diversity without the specter of the law? Because as it turns out, you can do that without legal prodding. Now, as Damon points out beautifully, it is not perfect. We can put together all of the other affirmative action-esque strategies, class-based strategies, banishing legacy admissions, getting rid of the SAT, and nothing will be quite as effective as models have shown. Nothing would be quite as effective as affirmative action was, but we can still do those things. And so I think the challenge for us here is to do those things, to look at the places where those highly selective institutions will now reorient their energies when it comes to recruiting, which, evidence from California, where they have a head start in living this reality, shows that in light of the end of affirmative action, states tended to double down on reaching out to high schools, for example, and working with guidance counselors. So what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, if we know those types of programmatic outreaches work, are we going to invest in them at the same scale on the other side for students who do not go to elite high schools and do not have well-prepared guidance counselors with a student to guidance counselor ratio that allows them to provide personal attention? So it looks like knowing what works, which frankly, we have a lot of evidence about what works, investing in what works for the students who need it the most, and then everybody, whether they are Black or minority, are not saying this is the criteria by which we will judge whether a higher education institution is a quality institution. And that means judging it not on how well it produces the number of Supreme Court justices, perhaps, but judging it on how well it changes the circumstances of birth of the students who show up at the door, no matter how they show up. Once we decide that's the criteria by which we'll judge higher education institutions and we invest in those resources, no matter who we are, I think that the resources follow. And this is an opportunity where we've got to do it. And I think it matters to do it, whether or not the law is pointing, an arrow at our back or not.
Thank you all so much for this engaging conversation. I do want to turn it over to our audience for questions. As a reminder, you can submit your questions to the chat at any time, but we've received a number of questions in advance of the webinar. So thank you all who submitted your questions in advance. So the first question is, what advice or do you have any advice for the administration or federal lawmakers who are invested in maintaining equity and diversity in higher education? How should they move or be operating in this moment?
This is Damon. I would say, man, more and better. Racial balancing in admissions is not permitted. That said, if you have a state flagship or one of your larger state institutions or systems, like John leads, and that system does not reflect not just the diversity of population statewide, but the diversity of the high school students in the state, then the question is, are you fulfilling your mission? If it's a private institution, then you can actually get more intricate with your mission in some ways. It's not geographically bound. So I would say expect and demand more even within the bounds of the law. That's for policymakers.
Now, I would just add double Pell, right? In 1980, Pell Grant accounted for 80% of the cost of public higher education. Today, it's something like 28%. We've essentially shifted the cost of education from being a public good to something that we put on students and their families through borrowing. And I give the Biden administration a lot of credit for tackling the student debt issue. But to tackle it going forward, we ought to have a much bigger federal commitment to supporting our students in getting the higher education they need for success in our economy. Doubling Pell would help to achieve that.
Yeah, as John says, our biggest stick at the federal level, as anybody in the federal government on the call would know, is financial, right? And so that is the primary mechanism. I think there's leadership, obviously, but there is, it is financial. And so I cannot support enough John's point that you double Pell and maybe even consider programs out there that look at pegging Pell to inflation, to the cost of living, cost of attendance, and et cetera. These things that we know are relative to where students are when they enter school. And so that is a bigger question of affordability. And then also to support, I think we need a wholesale support of investing in the institutions that we already know will have to take up the slack of demand. And so I actually think that there have been very good conversations and leadership on the issue of saying we need to fund historically Black colleges, even if it is just saying to the states, you need to live up to your mission to invest in them, and keeping that as part of the conversation. But we also know that we will need to look at differential funding and expanding federal resources to historically Black colleges and minority serving institutions across this country, and being very aggressive and robust about this being a direct response, I think, to this decision. So not doing that in a vacuum, but saying, this is the climate we have, this is how we'll address it, and telling people that that is part of what we're doing.
Thank you. The next question is, accreditation seems to be the next target for anyone pushing an anti-diversity agenda. Is there room for accreditors to be more robust champions for diversity and equity issues? Don't everybody jump in.
I was going to let Damon start on that one. I'll just say, look, if you're an accreditor, your job has to include making sure that the schools you accredit are fulfilling the mission of higher education. If they don't have students of color, if they don't have faculty of color, if they don't have diverse leadership teams, they're not fulfilling the mission. If they are graduating students who have not been exposed to course content that touches on themes of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're not fulfilling the mission of higher education. They're not preparing students for the workplace of the 21st century or participation in our civic life. So, the challenge is accreditors have often have a very narrow, some might say bureaucratic frame for their function. But if we zoom out and say, what should an accreditor be doing? Shouldn't they be ensuring that their institutions do the thing that we expect higher ed to do?
Yeah, this is Tressie. You saw me being hesitant because, we always want accreditors to step in more aggressively. I'm a veteran of the for-profit college debate and the student loan debates. And in all of those, we've always wanted accreditors to take a more robust role in shaping what should be the acceptable and desirable determinations for how higher education should operate. And we have not had significant success there, which is why I'm hesitant to say there's the perfect world, there's the ideal world. And with all due, respect, I think, to accreditors, themselves under-resourced and understaffed, and I think under-leveraged for this moment. I think we often think of accreditors as being this very robust sector because it shares such an important amount of responsibility with the federal and the state in regulating higher education. But relative to those two, that's like two gorillas and like a baby chimpanzee, right? The accreditors just aren't nearly as robust. I, however, do think that there is a role for advocacy in the accreditation sector. I also would love to see activists and legislators in particular take seriously the role of providing guidance for that sector. One of the things I think we can do, knowing that they are under-resourced for this moment in expertise, in labor, in people power, is to say, this is what we think you should do and what that would look like. So providing things like the wonderful guidance that Damon and his crew have done overall and how to interpret this decision. I think there's a wonderful role for people to do that for accreditors and understanding accreditors as that audience. Yeah.
This is Damon. I'm going to borrow from another very fraught context. That's the NCAA in terms of student athletes. Has a lot of issues over the years, and their business model and the impact on student athletes is shifting. So granted that, but there's a concept in NCAA investigations called loss of institutional control. When you don't have the right controls in place to comply with whatever the rules of the road are. Now, what if we just took that little part of NCAA and applied that to accreditation? It seems to me, and I'm not the most experienced on higher ed accreditation, granted, but it seems to me that all the student experience on campus, whether there are EEOC complaints, whether there's ongoing lawsuits, does that even really matter in accreditation? It sometimes feels like it doesn't. And so it was really about a question of what are our priorities? What matters in accreditation at all? And I like to think that all of these issues of not just numbers and access, but also success, who's matriculating, who's graduating, and what the on-campus experience is like. Is it a hospitable or hostile environment? That should matter for accreditation, should be part of the core business model. And then I think there's a bigger meta question about accreditors, which is, do they lead or do they lag? In a sense of, are they leading the way or are they just responding to what happens? So I think John and Tracy probably have better insights to move that conversation forward than I do, but from a civil rights perspective, that's what comes up for me.
All right, and then we have 1 minute before we wrap, but I have one last question and anyone can respond, but I'm just curious about what do you think that the K through 12 and higher education could do together to respond to this?
This is Damon. I think every institution is a bit different, but when you're talking about your SUNYs or like Rutgers Newark, the ability to have what some people call community centeredness or a pipeline with K through 12. I love what Nancy Cantor did in Rutgers Newark. I love, in this form of his leadership, the things that John King is doing. And I think there are lots of examples. It takes not just 2 to tango, but like 20 to tango. This stuff is very, very complicated. But if we can have a clear pathway, whether it be for admission, for early college credit, for financing the education, as John has reminded us multiple times, Pell or otherwise, it creates not just a sense of possibility, but actual tangible pathways. That's what affirmative action is all about. That's what Justice O'Connor wrote about in Grutter, visible pathways to opportunity. There's not just one way to do that. I think there's lots of different ways to do that. So I love to see the tighter connections. I think for the private institutions, it's more complicated, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't try in that regard. I'll stop there.
Just a quick amen to what Damon said. And the one thing I would add is, higher ed is responsible for training the teachers. We do not have enough Black teachers. We do not have enough Latino teachers. We do not have enough bilingual teachers. And higher ed has to step up to try to respond to those gaps.
Well, I just want to thank you all for joining us for this great conversation. Thank you to our speakers, the Century Foundation and the NYU Wagner. A recording will be available immediately on tcf.org. And thank you for joining and learning. To learn more about our future events, please visit tcf.org and wagner.nyu.edu.